Welcome to the New Mom Talk podcast, your go-to podcast for evidence-based answers to your burning questions about parenting. Join us as we dive into commonly Googled topics and hear from experts and real moms. Let's navigate parenthood together, one question at a time. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about an unmedicated or low intervention birth. So we have Hannah Gill, who is also a podcaster and a doula.
My name is Hannah Gill. I am from South Central Indiana, not too far south of Indianapolis. I live here with my husband and my two kids. And I actually started my business as a doula and childbirth educator after the birth of my first child, my son. It was a very unplanned, traumatic C-section experience. So I went on from there to start learning more about birth and then wound up becoming a doula and childbirth educator. And for the podcast, I really just I love podcasts and listening to podcasts. So I'm used to that medium and that way of absorbing content. And I wanted to just talk about all of these topics that many people are researching as they prepare for their own births. And that's kind of how it unfolded.
I love that because that's the same reason why I created my podcast. It's an easier way and an alternative way to get the information that doesn't require your eyes and
Right.
hands, right? Like you can,
Multitasking.
yes, like I can unload the dishwasher while I'm doing this and learning.
hmm
So let's go ahead and start off. Can you talk a little bit about what an unmedicated birth is and what this could potentially look like?
Yeah, so I want to first kind of define unmedicated birth because people have different opinions on what exactly that is. For the context of this episode, I'm talking about birthing without pain medication. So epidural, narcotics, nitrous gas. So unmedicated without those types of drugs for pain medication. But some people would say an unmedicated birth only is considered unmedicated if you also don't have Pitocin or any other type of drug. But in the context of this episode, it's just pain medication. And there's multiple types of pain medication as well. So this would be like a completely unmedicated situation for pain. But that type of birth is going to look different depending on where you're giving birth. So whether you're at a hospital, a freestanding birth center, or at home, obviously a home birth is going to look way different than a hospital. There's not going to be pain medications even available there. So kind of what setting you're in is going to kind of determine how an unmedicated birth looks, as well as if you're induced or not. So an unmedicated birth is going to look much different when you're being induced versus not induced, because Pitocin is notorious for making contractions much stronger and more intense than a natural contraction would be.
So when we talk about a low intervention birth, then would that be considered having some options outside of like pain medication, or what would that kind of look like?
Yeah, so for like low intervention, because for me personally, I considered my second birth as low intervention, but it really started in pregnancy more than just birth. So there's so many different interventions that could be considered or opted for throughout pregnancy and birth. Really, mine started with not getting cervical checks and then all the way through not having an epidural, not being induced, not having a continuous IV, those types of things. There's some interventions you may or may not want to avoid depending on your personal preference, but just basically avoiding all the unnecessary extra interventions that may not really be needed for the birth process.
Let's go back over to an unmedicated birth because I always wonder this myself. How would a mama be able to know if they could handle one, right? Like I just think about like the pain that you hear people talk about before you yourself go through it. So if it's your first time going through it and you hear that it's super painful, whatnot, how do you know that you can handle it?
So a lot of people equate to like birthing unmedicated and it has to do with your pain tolerance. And that's understandable that you would think like, oh, I have a low pain tolerance. There's no way I could ever birth unmedicated. But it's less about the pain tolerance and more about the physical and mental preparation for the experience that you do throughout pregnancy. So I talk about it similarly to, I know this is completely different, but like marathon or long distance runners, your mind is going to give up way before your body does. Birth is much more mental than it is physical, but it does take that consistent preparation throughout pregnancy to get through everything unmedicated. But it's really less about your pain tolerance and more about that consistent prep beforehand.
Well, and it kind of is a marathon when you think about it. It's a 9 month long
Yeah.
marathon.
Yeah. And it's because, for example, so my first birth, I had wanted to go unmedicated, but I did not do anything to prepare for that other than just like a regular childbirth education class through my hospital. And as soon as contractions started, like I went to the hospital right away, got an epidural right away. I just like, I can't do this type of thing. And then my second birth, I knew I wanted to go unmedicated again. And I knew, okay, this time I actually have to prepare myself for what that's going to look like. So I just did some additional prep. And I'll talk about that a little bit too on the type of prep you can do because it's going to be different for everyone. So my pain tolerance didn't change between my two births. Just what I did to prepare ahead of time is what changed drastically.
That makes sense. And knowing what you're going to experience
Hmm.
also kind of helps.
Yeah.
What would you possibly have any sort of statistics to share as far as comparison to the pain or the length of labor or anything that would be able to make this manageable? So, for example, if you want to go unmedicated, does that help with the length of labor versus if you
If
go through?
Yeah, so if you, for most first-time moms in general, labor is going to be between like 12 and 30 hours. And it's going to depend on your personal situation. Obviously, everyone's birth is going to be so different. Even if you've had multiple births yourself, they're all going to look very different. So generally 12 to 30 hours. There's back and forth evidence on if an epidural, we'll just specifically talk about an epidural, if it's going to prolong or shorten labor. And a lot of that has to do with if you don't have an epidural, if you are unmedicated, you're able to stay upright and mobile and moving and allowing yourself and your baby to get in like a good position to descend through the birth canal. But sometimes if you get an epidural, it can slow that process because you are constricted. You can't move as much. You can still have some movement, but you're not upright as much and moving around and feeling how your body needs to move. But in the event that, say, you are someone that is extremely tense and you're not able to control your breathing and you're stressing now and you just can't really relax your body at that point, that stress and that tension is actually prolonging your labor more. So, getting an epidural could help your body truly relax and make that labor process faster. But in general, it's recommended, if possible, to wait for an epidural until at least active labor. So generally between like 5 to 7 centimeters. But again, some women just have fast births. So even if you got it at 5 or 7 centimeters, it might not come in time. So just knowing, and it's hard to know your first time around too. You don't know how your body's going to birth because it's your first time. You don't know. So you could be a super long labor type person, or you could be a very fast, precipitous birth, and you just can't predict that. But in general, if you know I'm going to get an epidural, try to wait, but not so long that it's not going to be effective.
That was going to be my next question. So I know I feel like this is so hard to determine because you hear like, yes, you don't want to wait too long. You hear stories about people that are like, well, I waited too long and I just couldn't have one anymore. So
Mhm.
there was no other option.
The hard
Or
part, yeah, the hard part with that. So if you get it too early, like if you get to the hospital and you're like 3 centimeters and you're not really experiencing very intense contractions, but you get the epidural right away just in case, again, you're going to be constricted. You're not going to be up and moving as much. So it's going to be harder for you and baby to get into a good position. And then that also, some people have side effects to epidurals, like that is a possibility. So the sooner you get an epidural, the sooner the potential for those side effects to happen. But as far as getting it late, so as a doula, I've seen clients get epidurals at 8 centimeters and then it be fine. I've seen them get it at 8 centimeters and not be able to sit still to even get the epidural to be placed effectively. So again, if you say you're 8 centimeters and you're completely calm and you're like, well, I might want this epidural for pushing, you can go ahead and get that. But if your body is not able to relax enough for the anesthesiologist to even place it, then that's going to be something to consider.
yeah. So as with every birth, right? Or every pregnancy, like you just don't know how your body's going to react. So it's this kind
Mhm.
of like guessing.
I had no
I had
idea.
no
I had no
idea.
I had
idea.
no idea.
I had no
I
idea.
had no idea.
If you've ever said, I had no idea when it came to your parenting journey, followed by a smile, laugh, or cry, then listen up because this is for you. My name is Kelly, a stay-at-home mom of two wild, crazy, and fun little girls and host of Oh Baby, I Had No Idea, the podcast/YouTube channel. Each week, you'll get to hear my laid-back chats with other moms and dads from around the world as we explore some of our I had no idea parenting moments throughout our pregnancies, births, postpartum, and of course, the joyful chaos that is everyday lives with kids. You'll also get a wide variety of behind-the-scenes looks into some not-so-often talked-about topics that need so much more awareness. If you're looking for something that's entertaining / semi-educational / might just make you feel a little less crazy in your own parenting journey, then this is it. Just type in "Oh Baby, I Had No Idea" in your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube to join us in the fun. See you there.
And it's something I do want to make this point. It's a very important point to consider because there are women that 100% know, like, I want to get an epidural. And then there are women that I want to 100% be unmedicated. Regardless of how you want to birth, I always recommend everyone to prepare to birth as if an epidural and pain medication is not going to be an option for you. Because epidurals have about a 20% failure rate, or they could work, but only on one side of your body.
Ooh.
Or labor could be so fast that you can't get an epidural. And then there's also the potential that a medical condition could arise that would risk you out of even getting an epidural. So an example of that would be gestational thrombocytopenia, which is where your blood platelets are lowered. They continue to drop throughout pregnancy, and that could have a clotting risk where your blood doesn't clot. So it would risk you out of getting an epidural because of potential for bleeding. So there are possibilities where an epidural may not be an option, and being able to prepare for birth as if it's not going to be an option will set you up for the best success to be able to cope still without suffering and not knowing how to get through it. So even if you do 100% want an epidural, have those pain coping techniques in the back pocket if it's needed, if for some reason you can't have one.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, it does make sense to just kind of think about all of the possible options and all of the possible ways that your birth can go. So just to know what your resources or what is available to you.
Mm-hmm. Because even if you can't get an epidural, like I said, there's other types of pain medication. There are IV narcotics. There's nitrous gas, which doesn't really take away the pain, but it makes you kind of care less about the pain. So there are other options, but even outside of those, like chemical, medical pain coping techniques, think of like breathing techniques. Hypnobirthing is a huge one for a lot of women, either hypnobirthing or hypnobabies. There's different types of programs out there. There's also like breathwork courses. So learning how to like breathe and progressively relax your body, because breathing is like the biggest part of being able to relax your body throughout labor. The biggest things that increase the pain is going to be tense, like big tensity and having tense muscles, tense face, and then also not controlling your breath. So having that like rapid, like hyperventilating type breathing. So there's a lot of things you can do outside of just, oh, I'm going to have these pain medications to actually prepare to cope and get through everything unmedicated.
So since we're kind of talking about the low intervention birth, like what would this look like? What could you add as far as like the options or ways to prepare if this is something that you want to consider, but you want to keep it essentially unmedicated in a way?
Yeah. So the biggest thing, so obviously, like we're going to be talking about like low intervention birth, like in a hospital specifically, because at home, like you clearly have very little intervention possibility as long as you're not transferring to the hospital. But in a hospital, there's so many different interventions you could to consider. The first biggest one that's going to impact going unmedicated, like I said, is being induced because of the Pitocin use and because how intense that makes contractions. But even something as simple as like being hooked up to a continuous IV and you're not able to move around as much. So for my unmedicated birth, I had the HEP lock or saline lock, which is what the IV cord or tube actually connects to, but I did not have the continuous IV fluids running. So I was able to be up and moving and laboring in the bathroom and in the shower. So even something as simple as that, and then also like where you're moving about. So are you going to stay in the bed? Are you going to be in the bathroom? All those things are interventions to consider, and like the monitors, those are other things. So anything that allows you to have as much free movement and mobility as possible and being as hands off as you want it to be. So like if you have a doula or your birth partner, whatever that may look like, having them be knowledgeable about what you're wanting as well and how to best support you is going to set yourself up for the best success when having those low interventions.
I love that that's kind of a way to think about it as like being able to have mobility rather
Hmm.
than having to stay connected or, within a certain distance of this machine or near your bed.
Hmm. And some people, I mean, even when they're birthing unmedicated, they just want to lay down and relax. So everyone's birth is going to look different and how their body feels and what they instinctively feel like they need to be doing. For me, I wanted to be on the toilet and in the shower. That was my 100% where I spent my labor. I did not want to be laying in the bed. It was extremely uncomfortable for me. So just being unmedicated allows you really to tune into your body and see like what feels best to me right now. Is there a pain in a certain way that I need to move in a different direction and get in a different position? What feels instinctively right to my body right now? And that could be laying in the bed, or it could be walking around, it could be on a birth ball. So just having the ability to be up and moving. But I do want to make a note that even if you have an epidural, which many women don't realize this, you can still labor and push in different positions. So that is possible. You just have to have the support of your nurses or your birth team or whoever is there with you to either get on your hands and knees or on a squat bar, because being upright is the best way to allow gravity to help baby descend. So you don't want to be like laying on your back the whole time while you're laboring and pushing. Like that's not gonna set your baby up to get through there the way they need to. So even with an epidural, try to be as upright as possible.
It is nice to also know that this is starting to become a more common topic about
Hmm.
you don't have to be on your back. You don't have to be laying down. There's
Hmm.
different ways to have a baby.
Yep. Yep. And as far as like in general birthing unmedicated, like you can go in prepared and ready to birth unmedicated, but listen to your body. Like I said, if you're just not coping well and you're tense and you can't breathe and you're just stressing about it, like getting the epidural could help progress and speed your labor up. But if you are coping well and you're doing great, like then avoid that epidural as long as possible. And I do want to make another note about the pushing stage with an epidural. That is a big thing that for prolonged labor, the most evidence shows that it could potentially prolong the pushing phase, especially if your epidural is so strong to where you can't even feel the urge to push or how to effectively push. So most hospitals do have the capability to turn down that epidural before pushing, so you can really feel the push more. But a lot of women don't realize that they are able to turn it down or control it with a button. Some people have that in different hospitals as well. But being able to feel to instinctively have the urge to push is going to help that phase so much more.
Thank you. Well, my last question, do you have any other
Mhm.
tips, suggestions, or recommendations?
Yeah, so the first one, well, probably the main one would be so a lot of women who may not be sure about going unmedicated do what I like to suggest is some fear releasing exercises. So, what concerns you about going unmedicated? Really try to dive deep into the whys of why you want to birth the way you want to birth and doing that fear releasing, because a lot of people get scared and like childbirth is the most painful thing you're ever going to go through. Like, there's no way I can do it. So really reflecting on your personal decision and why you think you can't do that and try to do those fear releasing to really get in that mental state for birthing unmedicated and just surrendering to the process and to labor instead of fighting against it.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it is kind of like we've been, in a way, trained to fear it because you just hear so much about how painful it is, right?
Hmm.
Instead of just going in with an open mind and knowing that your experience is going to be very, very different from somebody else's story.
Yeah, because some people describe their birth as being completely pain-free, and they may have that experience and it may be pain-free for them. but other people describe childbirth as like very, very painful. Even my unmedicated birth, I mean, I felt a lot of intense pressures and sensations, but I was able to cope through it and breathe through it and work through it. And I wouldn't describe anything as being like the worst pain of my life. So everyone is going to react differently to it, but just knowing how your body best prepares for intense situations like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking your time to connect with us and talk about something that is just like, I feel like you just automatically are so afraid of it. At least I was,
Mhm.
because I didn't know what to expect. And for me, it was like, oh, no, 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 I could not do an unmedicated birth. I did not do an unmedicated birth. So it was, yeah, just something that I was like, oh, I hear
Especially
it
the
is
first
just a,
time around. You don't know. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what the experience is going to be like,
yeah.
but just really doing some prep ahead of time can help either
Well,
way, whether you go in medicated or unmedicated.
and to be fair, I also didn't know that there was such a thing as a postpartum doula. So clearly I did not know very much. And I feel like that is a big thing, right? We just
Yeah.
don't, we're not well informed because there's not enough information about what is available to us
Yeah.
as expecting parents.
I feel like that's one positive about social media lately is it is spreading more awareness about all of the options. So more women are becoming more aware of what they have at their disposal. So
Yeah. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you being here.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And I will have all of your details linked in the show notes,
Mhm.
along with the link to your podcast. If anybody wants to follow along, it's Motherhood Flow. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for our next episode. You can find us on Instagram for more updates and tips. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts and give us a review if you like us.